Well, the bairns are finally in bed, and so now I can tell my third wee story. And as I was telling them stories up there, I said to them, what do you think I should, what story do you think I should tell them? As the final third story. It's got to be about East Lothian and something to do with history and archaeology. And my youngest daughter Sky gave me this idea, and I thought I'll go for that. Now, well over 200 years ago, Tam was walking home. Now, he was walking along the southern edge at Tripane Law. Now, of course, there was no street lights in those days, and you couldn't hear a torch. But fortunately for Tam, there was a full moon up in the sky, so there was enough light to be able to just see where he was going, which is just as well, because if truth be told, he was a wee bit mair than merry. So he was kind of staggering home rather than walking home, but he was getting at least in the right direction. And then suddenly he stopped and he had a look and he thought, what's that? He saw in front of him a bright, bright light. I mean, it was really bright, brighter than 1,000 candles could have made. And he thought to himself, wait a minute, isn't he? Who's there? Where does that light come from? At first he thought he was seeing a fire. But no. Fire would be flickering and there would be smoke, and there was no smoke, and the brightness was too white to be fire. It wasn't the yellow colour of fire. What was it? And so he decided, aided by the fact he was a wee bit Uncle Fu, to go and investigate. And as he got closer to this bright, bright light, he started to hear the sound in music. And then he started to hear voices and laughter and singing. Somebody was having a party. Now, Tam liked a party, and so he headed towards the origin of this bright light. But as he approached closer, he started to get a sense of unease. His instinct told him that there was something no quite right about this. It wasn't any ordinary party going on. And so as he got closer to the source of this bright light, he slowed down, and then he got down on his hands and knees and started to edge forward till he got to a wee bush and had a wee peer to see what was going on. And he couldn't believe what his disbelieving eyes were showing him. There were hundreds and hundreds of wee folk, fairies. Not the fairies that you see in Disney movies, of course, but the ones that really exist. And they were having a party. They were playing music, they were dancing, having reels and jigs. There was food that Tam didn't recognise, but it looked extremely appetising. And the music, wow, it was fantastic. There was pipes, there was fiddles, and he could feel his feet starting to tap. And there he saw where the light was coming from. For the wee folk were dancing round the loft stane. And on the top of the loft stane, there was a muckle diamond placed carefully atop of it. And this diamond was catching the light from the moon, and then it was spreading it out in wisps, and so the moonlight was being spread. That's where the light was coming from. Tam couldn't keep his eyes off this huge magical diamond. And then as he watched, he realised they were having competitions, races. It was a tournament of some type. And then he saw the food, and then he watched the dancing, and he felt his feet beginning to jig and his whole body going like this, and he thought to himself, oh, this is a good party. And then he suddenly sobered up and he thought, wait a minute, this is the wee folk. No. The wee folk didn't like being spied upon. If they discover I'm spying on them, they're no going to be happy. And if they're no happy, who can say what they would do? They can be very capricious. They could take me into fairyland and I would never be seen again by my dear wife. My wife, I've got to tell her about this. So very carefully, he very gently moved away from his vantage point and reverse crawled along the field until he reckoned he was far enough away, stood up and ran as fast as he could back home. Suddenly he kind of felt really sober, and when he arrived home he burst into his house where his wife was waiting for him. "I'm sick of this, Tam. You're aye breaking your word. You said you would be here before sundown." "Never mind about that, never mind about that. Wait until I tell you what I've seen." "Aye, what is it this time?" she said. And he told her about the giant diamond catching the light for the moon, and the wee folk dancing round the loft stane, and the beautiful food that he could see, and the music and the dancing. "You're fou, Tam." "No, I'm not, or maybe a wee bit, but I'm telling you, it's true. I want to show you. Come with me," he said, "come with me, but you've got to be quiet." Now, obviously, she was a bit sceptical, but at the same time, she was a bit curious. Tam seemed to be so convinced that what he was saying was true, and usually she was quite good at figuring out when he was not telling the truth. And all the commotion had attracted the attention of the nearby neighbours, and they came through to check that everything was all right. And then, of course, Tam couldn't keep it to himself, and he told them the story as well. And so when his wife decided that she would come with him just to see if there was any substance in what her husband had been saying, the neighbours wanted to come as well. And so Tam agreed. "Aye, all right," he said. "There's safety in numbers when it comes to the wee folk," he said. "But what you've got to do is be really, really quiet." And sure enough, as he approached the location of the loft stane, there was the bright light, just as Tam had said there had been. "Tell ye? Now let's be quiet." And so, very quietly, Tam, his wife, and his neighbours tiptoed across the field towards the loft stane. And soon they could hear the sound of laughter and singing. Tam had been telling the truth. Now he couldn't speak. As they tiptoed very carefully closer and closer to the fairy tournament. But one of his neighbours suddenly stood on a twig, and it snapped, and in an instant everything was quiet. The wee folk had heard it, but they weren't quite sure what it was that they'd heard, so they were all standing deathly still, trying to hear another sound. The bright light was still on. The party was suspended while the fairies listened. Tam knew that they mustn't move in the darkness. But his wife developed a bit of a tickle in her nose, and she held it as a sneeze started to rise, and Tam saw his wife. She did her best. She did her best to hold it in. But this sneeze was going to come out sooner or later, and the longer it took, the louder it was going to be. Go! It was half sneeze and half bark. That was it. The light went off, and in the darkness there was a sound of hundreds of wee scuffling feet scuffling away back to the fairy hill, Trapainlaw. By the time Tam and his wife and his neighbours got to the stane, nothing was there, and a dark cloud went over the moon, plunging them into darkness, and so they had to gang home. Well, first light in the morning, Tam was up, and he retraced his steps back to the loft stane. And when he got there, of course, the diamond was no longer atop of the stain. But when he looked carefully around the base and at the edge of the field and into the field and where the stain was, there were lots and lots of wee tiny footprints, which confirmed to him that he hadn't imagined it. There had indeed been a fairy tournament. So that's the end of my third and last story for this festival. Thank you very much for being invited, and I hope those who've listened in have enjoyed these three tales. All three of them are from my first book, East Lothian Folk Tales, which was beautifully illustrated by Mags McFarlane. Sky, my daughter, my youngest daughter, she has always enjoyed the fairy tournament from that book, most I think. And that's the thing about stories, especially when they're connected to a place. Once you tell a story about a place, the place becomes far more fascinating. And of course, once you've told a story like the fairy tournament, you kind of want to go to the Lothstein. And whether you're a bairn or a grown-up, stories make places more interesting. And we can see that with movies. People see a movie and they want to go to the place, or they read a book about a place and they want to go there. And East Lothian is soaked with stories, historical and traditional folk tales, and to tell them to your children, to your grandchildren, to your peers, sometimes even to yourself, is really important. It's important for so many reasons. If we don't tell stories, eventually we will lose them. Stories, whether historical or traditional folk tales, all have an element of truth in them. They root us in place, they give us a sense of belonging and who we are, and they help us to understand the landscape that we live in. And stories can connect us with that inner truth that we all share. So thank you very much, and maybe I'll see you next year. Cheerio.